about the end of the reign of the Emperor Paul I, that is to say, towards the middle of the first year of the 19th century, just as 4 o'clock in the afternoon was sounding from the church of St. Peter and St. Paul, whose gilded vane overlooks the ramparts of the fortress, a crowd, composed of all sorts and conditions of people, began to gather in front of a house which belonged to General Count Chermayloff, formerly military governor of a fair-sized town in the government of Poltava. The first spectators had been attracted by the preparations which they saw had been made in the middle of the courtyard for administering torture with the knout. One of the general's serfs, he who acted as barber, was to be the victim. Although this kind of punishment was a common enough sight in St. Petersburg, it nevertheless attracted all passers-by when it was publicly administered. This was the occurrence which had caused a crowd, as just mentioned, before General Chermayloff's house. The spectators, even had they been in a hurry, would have had no cause to complain of being kept waiting, for at 4:30 a young man of about 25, in the handsome uniform of an aide-de-camp, his breast covered with decorations, appeared on the steps at the farther end of the courtyard in front of the house. These steps faced the large gateway, and led to the general's apartments. Arrived on the steps, the young aide-de-camp stopped a moment and fixed his eyes on a window, the closely drawn curtains of which did not allow him the least chance of satisfying his curiosity, whatever may have been its cause. Seeing that it was useless and that he was only wasting time in gazing in that direction, he made a sign to a bearded man who was standing near a door which led to the servants' quarters. The door was immediately opened, and the culprit was seen advancing in the middle of a body of serfs and followed by the executioner. The serfs were forced to attend the spectacle, that it might serve as an example to them. The culprit was the general's barber, as we have said, and the executioner was merely the coachman, who, being used to the handling of a whip, was raised or degraded, which you will, to the office of executioner every time punishment with the knout was ordered. This duty did not deprive him of either the esteem or even the friendship of his comrades, for they well knew that it was his arm alone that punished them and that his heart was not in his work. As Ivan's arm as well as the rest of his body was the property of the general, and the latter could do as he pleased with it, no one was astonished that it should be used for this purpose. More than that, correction administered by Ivan was nearly always gentler than that meted out by another, for it often happened that Ivan, who was a good-natured fellow, juggled away 1 or 2 strokes of the knout in a dozen, or if he were forced by those assisting at the punishment to keep a strict calculation, he maneuvered so that the tip of the lash struck the deal plank on which the culprit was lying, thus taking much of the sting out of the stroke. Accordingly, when it was Ivan's turn to be stretched upon the fatal plank and to receive the correction he was in the habit of administering, on his own account, those who momentarily played his part as executioner adopted the same expedients, remembering only the strokes spared and not the strokes received. This exchange of mutual benefits, therefore, was productive of an excellent understanding between Ivan and his comrades, which was never so firmly knit as at the moment when a fresh execution was about to take place. It is true that the first hour after the punishment was generally so full of suffering that the knouted was sometimes unjust to the knouter, but this feeling seldom outlasted the evening, and it was rare when it held out after the first glass of spirits that the operator drank to the health of his patient. The serf upon whom Ivan was about to exercise his dexterity was a man of 5 or 36, red of hair and beard, a little above average height. His Greek origin might be traced in his countenance, which even in its expression of terror had preserved its habitual characteristics of craft and cunning. When he arrived at the spot where the punishment was to take place, the culprit stopped and looked up at the window which had already claimed the young aide-de-camp's attention. It still remained shut. With a glance round the throng which obstructed the entrance leading to the street, he ended by gazing, with a horror-stricken shudder, upon the plank on which he was to be stretched. The shudder did not escape his friend Ivan, who, approaching to remove the striped shirt that covered his shoulders, took the opportunity to whisper under his breath, "Come, Gregory, take courage." "You remember your promise," replied the culprit, with an indefinable expression of entreaty. "Not for the first lashes, Gregory, do not count on that, for during the first strokes the aide-de-camp will be watching, but among the later ones be assured I will find means of cheating him of some of them." Beyond everything, you will take care of the tip of the lash? I will do my best, Gregory, I will do my best. Do you not know that I will? Alas! Yes, replied Gregory. Now, then, said the aide-de-camp. We are ready, noble sir, replied Ivan. Wait one moment, your high origin, cried poor Gregory, addressing the young captain as though he had been a colonel, Vashvusokority, in order to flatter him. I believe that the Lady Vaninka's window is about to open. The young captain glanced eagerly towards the spot which had already several times claimed his attention, but not a fold of the silken curtains, which could be seen through the panes of the window, had moved. You are mistaken, you rascal, said the aide-de-camp, unwillingly removing his eyes from the window, as though he also had hoped to see it open. You are mistaken, and besides, what has your noble mistress to do with all this? Pardon, your excellency, continued Gregory, gratifying the aide-de-camp with yet higher rank, pardon, but it is through her orders I am about to suffer. Perhaps she might have pity upon a wretched servant. Enough, let us proceed, said the captain in an odd voice, as though he regretted as well as the culprit that Vaninka had not shown mercy. Immediately, noble sir, said Ivan, then turning to Gregory, he continued, Come, comrade, the time has come. Gregory sighed heavily, threw a last look up at the window, and seeing that everything remained the same there, he mustered up resolution enough to lie down on the fatal plank. At the same time 2 other serfs, chosen by Ivan for assistance, took him by the arms and attached his wrists to 2 stakes, one at either side of him, so that it appeared as though he were stretched on a cross. Then they clamped his neck into an iron collar, and seeing that all was in readiness and that no sign favorable to the culprit had been made from the still closely shut window, the young aide-de-camp beckoned with his hand, saying, Now, then, begin. Patience, my lord, patience, said Ivan, still delaying the whipping, in the hope that some sign might yet be made from the inexorable window. I have a knot in my knout, and if I leave it Gregory will have good right to complain. The instrument with which the executioner was busying himself, and which is perhaps unknown to our readers, was a species of whip, with a handle about 2 feet long. A plated leather thong, about 4 feet long and 2 inches broad, was attached to this handle, this thong terminating in an iron or copper ring, and to this another band of leather was fastened, 2 feet long, and at the beginning about 1½ inches thick. This gradually became thinner, till it ended in a point. The thong was steeped in milk and then dried in the sun, and on account of this method of preparation its edge became as keen and cutting as a knife. Further, the thong was generally changed at every 6th stroke, because contact with blood softened it. However unwillingly and clumsily Ivan set about untying the knot, it had to come undone at last. Besides, the bystanders were beginning to grumble, and their muttering disturbed the reverie into which the young aide-de-camp had fallen. He raised his head, which had been sunk on his breast, and cast a last look towards the window, then with a peremptory sign, and in a voice which admitted of no delay, he ordered the execution to proceed. Nothing could put it off any longer. Ivan was obliged to obey, and he did not attempt to find any new pretext for delay. He drew back 2 paces, and with a spring he returned to his place, and standing on tiptoe, he whirled the knout above his head, and then letting it suddenly fall, he struck Gregory with such dexterity that the lash wrapped itself thrice round his victim's body, encircling him like a serpent, but the tip of the thong struck the plank upon which Gregory was lying. Nevertheless, in spite of this precaution, Gregory uttered a loud shriek, and Ivan counted 1. At the shriek, the young aide-de-camp again turned towards the window, but it was still shut, and mechanically his eyes went back to the culprit, and he repeated the word 1. The knout had traced 3 blue furrows on Gregory's shoulders. Ivan took another spring, and with the same skill as before he again enveloped the culprit's body with the hissing thong, ever taking care that the tip of it should not touch him. Gregory uttered another shriek, and Ivan counted 2. The blood now began to color the skin. At the third stroke several drops of blood appeared, at the fourth the blood spurted out, at the fifth some drops spattered the young officer's face. He drew back, and wiped them away with his handkerchief. Ivan profited by his distraction, and counted 7 instead of 6, the captain took no notice. At the ninth stroke Ivan stopped to change the lash, and in the hope that a second fraud might pass off as luckily as the first, he counted 11 instead of 10. At that moment a window opposite to Vaninka's opened, and a man about 45 or 50 in general's uniform appeared. He called out in a careless tone, "Enough, that will do," and closed the window again. Immediately on this apparition the young Aduka had turned towards his general, saluting, and during the few seconds that the general was present he remained motionless. When the window had been shut again, he repeated the general's words, so that the raised whip fell without touching the culprit. "Thank His Excellency, Gregory," said Ivan, rolling the knout-slash round his hand, "for having spared you 2 strokes, and he added, bending down to liberate Gregory's hand, "These 2 with the 2 I was able to miss out make a total of 8 strokes instead of 12. Come, now, you others, untie his other hand." But poor Gregory was in no state to thank anybody, nearly swooning with pain, he could scarcely stand. 2 moujiks took him by the arms and led him towards the serfs' quarters, followed by Ivan. Having reached the door, however, Gregory stopped, turned his head, and seeing the Aduka gazing pitifully at him, "Oh sir," he cried, "please thank His Excellency the General for me. As for the Lady Vaninka," he added in a low tone, "I will certainly thank her myself." "What are you muttering between your teeth?" cried the young officer, with an angry movement, for he thought he had detected a threatening tone in Gregory's voice. "Nothing, sir, nothing," said Ivan. "The poor fellow was merely thanking you, Mr. Fodor, for the trouble you have taken in being present at his punishment, and he says that he has been much honored, that is all." "That is right," said the young man, suspecting that Ivan had somewhat altered the original remarks, but evidently not wishing to be better informed. "If Gregory wishes to spare me this trouble another time, let him drink less vodka, or else, if he must get drunk, let him at least remember to be more respectful." Ivan bowed low and followed his comrades. Fodor entered the house again, and the crowd dispersed, much dissatisfied that Ivan's trickery and the general's generosity had deprived them of 4 strokes of the knout, exactly a third of the punishment. Now that we have introduced our readers to some of the characters in this history, we must make them better acquainted with those who have made their appearance, and must introduce those who are still behind the curtain. General Count Chermayloff, as we have said, after having been governor of one of the most important towns in the environs of Poltava, had been recalled to St. Petersburg by the Emperor Paul, who honored him with his particular friendship. The general was a widower, with 1 daughter, who had inherited her mother's fortune, beauty, and pride. Vaninka's mother claimed descent from one of the chieftains of the Tartar race, who had invaded Russia, under the leadership of Genghis, in the 13th century. Vaninka's naturally haughty disposition had been fostered by the education she had received. His wife being dead, and not having time to look after his daughter's education himself, General Chermayloff had procured an English governess for her. This lady, instead of suppressing her pupils' scornful propensities, had encouraged them, by filling her head with those aristocratic ideas which have made the English aristocracy the proudest in the world. Amongst the different studies to which Vaninka devoted herself, there was one in which she was specially interested, and that one was, if one may so call it, the science of her own rank. She knew exactly the relative degree of nobility and power of all the Russian noble families, those that were a grade above her own, and those of whom she took precedence. She could give each person the title which belonged to their respective rank, no easy thing to do in Russia, and she had the greatest contempt for all those who were below the rank of excellency. As for serfs and slaves, for her they did not exist, they were mere bearded animals, far below her horse or her dog in the sentiments which they inspired in her, and she would not for one instant have weighed the life of a serf against either of those interesting animals. Like all the women of distinction in her nation,
Vaninka was a good musician, and spoke French, Italian, German, and English equally well.
Her features had developed in harmony with her character. Vaninka was beautiful, but her beauty was perhaps a little too decided. Her large black eyes, straight nose, and lips curling scornfully at the corners, impressed those who saw her for the first time somewhat unpleasantly. This impression soon wore off with her superiors and equals, to whom she became merely an ordinary charming woman, whilst to subalterns and such like she remained haughty and inaccessible as a goddess. At 17 Vaninka's education was finished, and her governess, who had suffered in health through the severe climate of St. Petersburg, requested permission to leave. This desire was granted with the ostentatious recognition of which the Russian nobility are the last representatives in Europe. Thus Vaninka was left alone, with nothing but her father's blind adoration to direct her. She was his only daughter, as we have mentioned, and he thought her absolutely perfect. Things were in this state in the general's house when he received a letter, written on the deathbed of one of the friends of his youth. Count Romailov had been exiled to his estates, as a result of some quarrel with Potemkin, and his career had been spoilt. Not being able to recover his forfeited position, he had settled down about 400 leagues from St. Petersburg, broken-hearted, distressed probably less on account of his own exile and misfortune than of the prospects of his only son, Fodor. The Count, feeling that he was leaving this son alone and friendless in the world, commended the young man, in the name of their early friendship, to the general, hoping that, owing to his being a favorite with Paul I, he would be able to procure a lieutenancy in a regiment for him. The general immediately replied to the Count that his son should find a second father in himself, but when this comforting message arrived, Romailov was no more, and Fodor himself received the letter and carried it back with him to the general, when he went to tell him of his loss and to claim the promised protection. So great was the general's dispatch, that Paul I, at his request, granted the young man a sub-lieutenancy in the Semenevskoye regiment, so that Fodor entered on his duties the very next day after his arrival in St. Petersburg. Although the young man had only passed through the general's house on his way to the barracks, which were situated in the Light Noi quarter, he had remained there long enough for him to have seen Vaninka, and she had produced a great impression upon him. Fodor had arrived with his heart full of primitive and noble feelings. His gratitude to his protector, who had opened a career for him, was profound, and extended to all his family. These feelings caused him perhaps to have an exaggerated idea of the beauty of the young girl who was presented to him as a sister, and who, in spite of this title, received him with the frigidity and hauteur of a queen. Nevertheless, her appearance, in spite of her cool and freezing manner, had left a lasting impression upon the young man's heart, and his arrival in St. Petersburg had been marked by feelings till then never experienced before in his life. As for Vaninka, she had hardly noticed Fodor, for what was a young sub-lieutenant, without fortune or prospects, to her? What she dreamed of was some princely alliance, that would make her one of the most powerful ladies in Russia, and unless he could realize some dream of the Arabian Nights, Fodor could not offer her such a future. Some time after this first interview, Fodor came to take leave of the general. His regiment was to form part of a contingent that Field Marshal Suvorov was taking to Italy, and Fodor was about to die, or show himself worthy of the noble patron who had helped him to a career. This time, whether on account of the elegant uniform that heightened Fodor's natural good looks, or because his imminent departure, glowing with hope and enthusiasm, lent a romantic interest to the young man, Vaninka was astonished at the marvelous change in him, and deigned, at her father's request, to give him her hand when he left. This was more than Fodor had dared to hope. He dropped upon his knee, as though in the presence of a queen, and took Vaninka's between his own trembling hands, scarcely daring to touch it with his lips. Light though the kiss had been, Vaninka started as though she had been burnt. She felt a thrill run through her, and she blushed violently. She withdrew her hand so quickly that Fodor, fearing this adieu, respectful though it was, had offended her, remained on his knees, and clasping his hands, raised his eyes with such an expression of fear in them, that Vaninka, forgetting her hauteur, reassured him with a smile. Fodor rose, his heart filled with inexplicable joy, and without being able to say what had caused this feeling, he only knew that it had made him absolutely happy, so that, although he was just about to leave Vaninka, he had never felt greater happiness in his life. The young man left dreaming golden dreams, for his future, be it gloomy or bright, was to be envied. If it ended in a soldier's grave, he believed he had seen in Vaninka's eyes that she would mourn him. If his future was glorious, glory would bring him back to St. Petersburg in triumph, and glory is a queen, who works miracles for her favorites. The army to which the young officer belonged crossed Germany, descended into Italy by the Tyrolese mountains, and entered Verona on the 14th of April, 1799. Suvorov immediately joined forces with General Melas, and took command of the two armies. General Chasteler next day suggested that they should reconnoiter. Suvorov, gazing at him with astonishment, replied, "I know of no other way of reconnoitering the enemy than by marching upon him and giving him battle." As a matter of fact, Suvorov was accustomed to this expeditious sort of strategy. Through it he had defeated the Turks at Fokhshany and Ismailov, and he had defeated the Poles, after a few days' campaign, and had taken Prague in less than 4 hours. Catherine, out of gratitude, had sent her victorious general a wreath of oak leaves, intertwined with precious stones, and worth 600,000 rubles, a heavy gold field marshal's baton encrusted with diamonds, and had created him a field marshal, with the right of choosing a regiment that should bear his name from that time forward. Besides, when he returned to Russia, she gave him leave of absence, that he might take a holiday at a beautiful estate she had given him, together with the 8,000 serfs who lived upon it. What a splendid example for Fodor! Suvorov, the son of a humble Russian officer, had been educated at the ordinary cadets' training college, and had left it as a sub-lieutenant like himself. Why should there not be two Suvorovs in the same century? Suvorov arrived in Italy preceded by an immense reputation, religious, strenuous, unwearied, impassible, loving with the simplicity of a Tartar and fighting with the fury of a Cossack. He was just the man required to continue General Melas's successes over the soldiers of the Republic, discouraged as they had been by the weak vacillations of Scherer. The Austro-Russian army of 100,000 men was opposed by only 29 or 30,000 French. Suvorov began as usual with a thundering blow. On April 20 he appeared before Brescia, which made a vain attempt at resistance. After a cannonade of about half an hour's duration, the Preskyra gate was forced, and the Corsico division, of which Fodor's regiment formed the vanguard, charged into the town, pursuing the garrison, which only consisted of 1,200 men, and obliged them to take refuge in the citadel. Pressed with an impetuosity the French were not accustomed to find in their enemies, and seeing that the scaling ladders were already in position against the ramparts, the Captain Bucre wished to come to terms, but his position was too precarious for him to obtain any conditions from his savage conquerors, and he and his soldiers were made prisoners of war. Suvorov was experienced enough to know how best to profit by victory. Hardly master of Brescia, the rapid occupation of which had discouraged our army anew, he ordered General Kray to vigorously press on the siege of Preskyra. General Kray therefore established his headquarters at Vallejo, a place situated at an equal distance between Preskyra and Mantua, and he extended from the Po to the lake of Garda, on the banks of the Mincio, thus investing the two cities at the same time. Meanwhile the commander-in-chief had advanced, accompanied by the larger part of his forces, and had crossed the Oglio in 2 columns. He launched one column, under General Rosenberg, towards Bergamo, and the other, with General Melas in charge, towards the Sirios, whilst a body of 7,000 or 8,000 men, commanded by General Kame and General Hohenzollern, were directed towards Placentia and Cremona, thus occupying the whole of the left bank of the Pa, in such a manner that the Austro-Russian army advanced deploying 80,000 men along a front of 45 miles. In view of the forces which were advancing, and which were 3 times as large as his own, Scherer beat a retreat all along the line. He destroyed the bridges over the Adda, as he did not consider that he was strong enough to hold them, and, having removed his headquarters to Milan, he awaited there the reply to a dispatch which he had sent to the Directory, in which, tacitly acknowledging his incapacity, he tendered his resignation. As the arrival of his successor was delayed, and as Suvorov continued to advance, Scherer, more and more terrified by the responsibility which rested upon him, relinquished his command into the hands of his most able lieutenant. The general chosen by him was Moreau, who was again about to fight those Russians in whose ranks he was destined to die at last.
Moreau's unexpected nomination was proclaimed amidst the acclamation of the soldiers.
He had been called the French Fabius, on account of his magnificent campaign on the Rhine. He passed his whole army in review, saluted by the successive acclamations of its different divisions, which cried, "Long live Moreau! Long live the savior of the army of Italy!" But however great this enthusiasm, it did not blind Moreau to the terrible position in which he found himself. At the risk of being outflanked, it was necessary for him to present a parallel line to that of the Russian army, so that, in order to face his enemy, he was obliged to extend his line from Lake Letko to Pizzigaiton, that is to say, a distance of 50 miles. It is true that he might have retired towards Piedmont and concentrated his troops at Alexandria, to await there the reinforcements the Directory had promised to send him. But if he had done this, he would have compromised the safety of the army at Naples, and have abandoned it, isolated as it was, to the mercy of the enemy. He therefore resolved to defend the passage of the Adda as long as possible, in order to give the division under Desoles, which was to be dispatched to him by Messina, time to join forces with him and to defend his left, whilst Gautier, who had received orders to evacuate Tuscany and to hasten with forced marches to his aid, should have time to arrive and protect his right. Moreau himself took the center, and personally defended the fortified bridge of Cassano. This bridge was protected by the Ritordo Canal, and he also defended it with a great deal of artillery and an entrenched vanguard. Besides, Moreau, always as prudent as brave, took every precaution to secure a retreat, in case of disaster, towards the Apennines and the coast of Genoa. Hardly were his dispositions completed before the indefatigable Suwarrow entered Trivellio. At the same time as the Russian commander-in-chief arrived at this last town, Moreau heard of the surrender of Bergamo and its castle, and on April 23 he saw the heads of the columns of the Allied army. The same day the Russian general divided his troops into 3 strong columns, corresponding to the 3 principal points in the French line, each column numerically more than double the strength of those to whom they were opposed. The right column, led by General Łukasiewicz, advanced towards Lake Letko, where General Serrurier awaited it. The left column, under the command of Melas, took up its position in front of the Cassano entrenchments, and the Austrian division, under General Zopfanat, which formed the center, concentrated at Canonia, ready at a given moment to seize Vaprio. The Russian and Austrian troops bivouacked within cannon shot of the French outposts. That evening, Fodor, who with his regiment formed part of Chasteler's division, wrote to General Chermayloff, "We are at last opposite the French, and a great battle must take place tomorrow morning. Tomorrow evening I shall be a lieutenant or a corpse." Next morning, April 26, cannon resounded at break of day from the extremities of the lines. On our left Prince Bagration's grenadiers attacked us, on our right General Seckendorf, who had been detached from the camp of Trivellio, was marching on Crema. These 2 attacks met with very different success. Bagration's grenadiers were repulsed with terrible loss, whilst Seckendorf, on the contrary, drove the French out of Crema, and pushed forward towards the bridge of Lodi. Fodor's predictions were falsified. His portion of the army did nothing the whole day. His regiment remained motionless, waiting for orders that did not come. Suwarrow's arrangements were not yet quite complete. The night was needed for him to finish them. During the night, Moreau, having heard of Seckendorf's success on his extreme right, sent an order to Serrurier commanding him to leave at Letko, which was an easy post to defend, the 18th Light Brigade and a detachment of dragoons only, and to draw back with the rest of his troops towards the center. Serrurier received this order about 2 o'clock in the morning, and executed it immediately. On their side the Russians had lost no time, profiting by the darkness of the night. General Łukasiewicz had repaired the bridge at Brivio, which had been destroyed by the French, whilst General Chasteler had built another bridge 2 miles below the castle of Trezzo. These 2 bridges had been, the one repaired and the other built, without the French outposts having the slightest suspicion of what was taking place. surprised at 2 o'clock in the morning by 2 Austrian divisions, which, concealed by the village of San Gervasio, had reached the right bank of the Adda without their being discovered. The soldiers defending the castle of Trezzo abandoned it and beat a retreat. The Austrians pursued them as far as Pozzo, but there the French suddenly halted and faced about, for General Serrurier was at Pozzo, with the troops he had brought from Lecco. He heard the cannonade behind him, immediately halted, and, obeying the first law of warfare, he marched towards the noise and smoke. It was therefore through him that the garrison of Trezzo rallied and resumed the offensive. Serrurier sent an aide-de-camp to Moreau to inform him of the maneuver he had thought proper to execute. The battle between the French and Austrian troops raged with incredible fury. Bonaparte's veterans, during their first Italian campaigns, had adopted a custom which they could not renounce. It was to fight His Imperial Majesty's subjects wherever they found them. Nevertheless, so great was the numerical superiority of the Allies, that our troops had begun to retreat, when loud shouts from the rear guard announced that reinforcements had arrived. It was General Grenier, sent by Moreau, who arrived with his division at the moment when his presence was most necessary. One part of the new division reinforced the center column, doubling its size. Another part was extended upon the left to envelop the enemy. The drums beat afresh down the whole line, and our grenadiers began again to reconquer this battlefield already twice lost and won. But at this moment the Austrians were reinforced by the Marquis de Chasteler and his division, so that the numerical superiority was again with the enemy. Grenier drew back his wing to strengthen the center, and Serrurier, preparing for retreat in case of disaster, fell back on Pozzo, where he awaited the enemy. It was here that the battle raged most fiercely. Thrice the village of Pozzo was taken and retaken, until at last, attacked for the 4th time by a force double their own in numbers, the French were obliged to evacuate it. In this last attack an Austrian colonel was mortally wounded, but, on the other hand, General Becker, who commanded the French rear guard, refused to retreat with his soldiers, and maintained his ground with a few men, who were slain as they stood. He was at length obliged to give up his sword to a young Russian officer of the Semenovskoye regiment, who, handing over his prisoner to his own soldiers, returned immediately to the combat. The two French generals had fixed on the village of Vaprio as a rallying place, but at the moment when our troops were thrown into disorder through the evacuation of Pozzo, the Austrian cavalry charged heavily, and Serrurier, finding himself separated from his colleague, was obliged to retire with 2,500 men to Verderio, whilst Grenier, having reached the appointed place, Vaprio, halted to face the enemy afresh. During this time a terrible fight was taking place in the center. Melas with 18 to 20,000 men had attacked the fortified posts at the head of the bridge of Cassano and the Ritorto Canal. About 7 o'clock in the morning, when Moreau had weakened himself by dispatching Grenier and his division, Melas, leading 3 battalions of Austrian grenadiers, had attacked the fortifications, and for 2 hours there was terrible carnage, thrice repulsed, and leaving more than 1,500 men at the base of the fortifications, the Austrians had thrice returned to the attack, each time being reinforced by fresh troops, always led on and encouraged by Melas, who had to avenge his former defeats. At length, having been attacked for the 4th time, forced from their entrenchments, and contesting the ground inch by inch, the French took shelter behind their second fortifications, which defended the entrance to the bridge itself. Here they were commanded by Moreau in person. There, for 2 more hours, a hand-to-hand struggle took place, whilst the terrible artillery belched forth death almost muzzle to muzzle. At last the Austrians, rallying for a last time, advanced at the point of the bayonet, and, lacking either ladders or fascines, piled the bodies of their dead comrades against the fortifications, and succeeded in scaling the breastworks. There was not a moment to be lost. Moreau ordered a retreat, and whilst the French were recrossing the Adda, he protected their passage in person with a single battalion of grenadiers, of whom at the end of half an hour not more than 120 men remained. 3 of his aides-de-camp were killed at his side. This retreat was accomplished without disorder, and then Moreau himself retired, still fighting the enemy, who set foot on the bridge as soon as he reached the other bank. The Austrians immediately rushed forward to capture him, when suddenly a terrible noise was heard rising above the roar of the artillery. The second arch of the bridge was blown into the air, carrying with it all those who were standing on the fatal spot. The armies recoiled, and into the empty space between them fell like rain a debris of stones and human beings. But at this moment, when Moreau had succeeded in putting a momentary obstacle between himself and Melas, General Grenier's division arrived in disorder, after having been forced to evacuate Vaprio, pursued by the Austro-Russians under Zopf, Ott, and Chasteler. Moreau ordered a change of front, and faced this new enemy, who fell upon him when he least expected them. He succeeded in rallying Grenier's troops and in re-establishing the battle. But whilst his back was turned, Melas repaired the bridge and crossed the river. Thus Moreau found himself attacked frontally, in the rear, and on his two flanks, by forces 3 times larger than his own. It was then that all the officers who surrounded him begged him to retreat, for on the preservation of his person depended the preservation of Italy for France. Moreau refused for some time, for he knew the awful consequences of the battle he had just lost, and he did not wish to survive it, although it had been impossible for him to win it. At last a chosen band surrounded him, and, forming a square, drew back, whilst the rest of the army sacrificed themselves to cover his retreat, for Moreau's genius was looked upon as the sole hope that remained to them. The battle lasted nearly 3 hours longer, during which the rear guard of the army performed prodigies of valor. At length Melas, seeing that the enemy had escaped him, and believing that his troops, tired by the stubborn fight, needed rest, gave orders that the fighting should cease. He halted on the left bank of the Adda, encamping his army in the villages of Imego, Gorgonzola, and Cassano, and remained master of the battlefield, upon which we had left 2,500 dead, 100 pieces of cannon, and 20 howitzers. That night Suvarow invited General Becker to supper with him, and asked him by whom he had been taken prisoner. Becker replied that it was a young officer belonging to the regiment which had first entered Pozo. Suvarow immediately inquired what regiment this was, and discovered that it was the Semenovskoy. He then ordered that inquiries should be made to ascertain the young officer's name. Shortly afterwards Sub-Lieutenant Fyodor Romailov was announced. He presented General Becker's sword to Suvarow, who invited him to remain and to have supper with his prisoner. Next day Fyodor wrote to his protector, "I have kept my word. I am a lieutenant, and Field Marshal Suvarow has requested His Majesty Paul I to bestow upon me the Order of St. Vladimir." On 28th of April, Suvarow entered Milan, which Moreau had just abandoned in order to retreat beyond Tizzino. The following proclamation was by his order posted on all the walls of the capital. It admirably paints the spirit of the Muscovite. The victorious army of the Apostolical and Roman Emperor is here. It has fought solely for the restoration of the Holy Faith, the clergy, nobility, and ancient government of Italy. People, join us for God and the faith, for we have arrived with an army at Milan and Placentia to assist you. The dearly bought victories of Trebia and Novi succeeded that of Cassano, and left Suvarow so much weakened that he was unable to profit by them. Besides, just when the Russian general was about to resume his march, a new plan of campaign arrived, sent by the Aulic Council at Vienna. The Allied powers had decided upon the invasion of France, and had fixed the route each general must follow in order to accomplish this new project. It was decided that Suvarow should invade France by Switzerland, and that the Archduke should yield him his positions and descend on the Lower Rhine. The troops with which Suvarow was to operate against Messina from this time were the 30,000 Russians he had with him, 30,000 others detached from the reserve army commanded by Count Tolstoy in Galicia, who were to be led to join him in Switzerland by General Korsakov, about 30,000 Austrians under General Hotz, and lastly, 5,000 or 6,000 French emigrants under the Prince de Condé in all, an army of 90,000 or 95,000 men. The Austrians were to oppose Moreau and MacDonald. Fyodor had been wounded when entering Novi, but Suvarow had rewarded him with a second cross, and the rank of captain hastened his convalescence, so that the young officer, more happy than proud of the new rank he had received, was in a condition to follow the army, when on September 13 it moved towards Salvidra and entered the valley of Tizzino. So far all had gone well, and as long as they remained in the rich and beautiful Italian plains, Suvarow had nothing but praise for the courage and devotion of his soldiers. But when to the fertile fields of Lombardy, watered by its beautiful river, succeeded the rough ways of the Levantine, and when the lofty summits of the St. Gothard, covered with the eternal snows, rose before them, their enthusiasm was quenched, their energy disappeared, and melancholy forebodings filled the hearts of these savage children of the north. Unexpected grumblings ran through the ranks, then suddenly the vanguard stopped, and declared that it would go no farther. In vain Foedor, who commanded a company, begged and entreated his own men to set an example by continuing the march. They threw down their arms, and lay down beside them. Just as they had given this proof of insubordination, fresh murmurs, sounding like an approaching storm, rose from the rear of the army. They were caused by the sight of Suwarrow, who was riding from the rear to the vanguard, and who arrived at the front accompanied by this terrible proof of mutiny and insubordination. When he reached the head of the column, the murmurings had developed into imprecations. Then Suwarrow addressed his soldiers with that savage eloquence to which he owed the miracles he had effected with them, but cries of retreat, retreat, drowned his voice. Then he chose out the most mutinous, and had them thrashed until they were overcome by this shameful punishment, but the thrashings had no more influence than the exhortation, and the shouts continued. Suwarrow saw that all was lost if he did not employ some powerful and unexpected means of regaining the mutineers. He advanced towards Foedor. "Captain," said he, "leave these fools here, take 8 non-commissioned officers and dig a grave." Foedor, astonished, gazed at his general as though demanding an explanation of this strange order. "Obey orders," said Suwarrow. Foedor obeyed, and the 8 men set to work, and 10 minutes later the grave was dug, greatly to the astonishment of the whole army, which had gathered in a semicircle on the rising slopes of the 2 hills which bordered the road, standing as if on the steps of a huge amphitheater. Suwarrow dismounted from his horse, broke his sword in 2 and threw it into the grave, detached his epaulets one by one and threw them after his sword, dragged off the decorations which covered his breast and cast these after the sword and epaulets, and then, stripping himself naked, he lay down in the grave himself, crying in a loud voice, "Cover me with earth. Leave your general here. You are no longer my children, and I am no longer your father. Nothing remains to me but death." At these strange words, which were uttered in so powerful a voice that they were heard by the whole army, the Russian grenadiers threw themselves weeping into the grave, and, raising their general, asked pardon of him, entreating him to lead them again against the enemy. "At last," cried Suwarrow, "I recognize my children again." "To the enemy!" Not cries but yells of joy greeted his words. Suwarrow dressed himself again, and whilst he was dressing the leaders of the mutiny crept in the dust to kiss his feet. Then, when his epaulets were replaced on his shoulders, and when his decorations again shone on his breast, he remounted his horse, followed by the army, the soldiers swearing with one voice that they would all die rather than abandon their father. The same day Suwarrow attacked Arello, but his luck had turned. The conqueror of Cassano, Trebia, and Novi had left his good fortune behind in the plains of Italy. For 12 hours 600 French opposed 3,000 Russian grenadiers beneath the walls of the town, and so successfully that night fell without Suwarrow being able to defeat them. Next day he marched the whole of his troops against this handful of brave men, but the sky clouded over and the wind blew a bitter rain into the faces of the Russians. The French profited by this circumstance to beat a retreat, evacuating the valley of Ursern, crossing the Reuss, and taking up their position on the heights of the Furka and Grimsel. One portion of the Russian army's design had been achieved. They were masters of the St. Gothard. It is true that as soon as they marched farther on, the French would retake it and cut off their retreat, but what did this matter to Suwarrow? Did he not always march forward? He marched on, then, without worrying about that which was behind him, reached Andermatt, cleared Trou de Uri, and found Lecourbe guarding the defile of the Devil's Bridge with 1,500 men. There the struggle began again. For 3 days 1,500 Frenchmen kept 30,000 Russians at bay. Suwarrow raged like a lion trapped in a snare, for he could not understand this change of fortune. At last, on the 4th day, he heard that General Korsakov, who had preceded him and who was to rejoin him later, had been beaten by Molitor, and that Messina had recaptured Zurich and occupied the canton of Glarus. Suwarrow now gave up the attempt to proceed up the valley of the Reuss, and wrote to Korsakov and Jaliki, "I hasten to retrieve your losses, stand firm as ramparts, you shall answer to me with your heads for every step and retreat that you take." The aide-de-camp was also charged to communicate to the Russian and Austrian generals a verbal plan of battle. Generals Linskin and Jaliki were to attack the French troops separately and then to join the forces in the valley of Glarus, into which Suwarrow himself was to descend by the Clonthal, thus hemming Molitor in between two walls of iron. Suwarrow was so sure that this plan would be successful, that when he arrived on the borders of the Lake of Clonthal, he sent a bearer with a flag of truce, summoning Molitor to surrender, seeing that he was surrounded on every side. Molitor replied to the field marshal that his proposed meeting with his generals had failed, as he had beaten them one after the other, and driven them back into the Grisons, and that moreover, in retaliation, as Messina was advancing by Muada, it was he, Suwarrow, who was between two fires, and therefore he called upon him to lay down his arms instead. On hearing this strange reply, Suwarrow thought that he must be dreaming, but soon recovering himself and realizing the danger of his position in the defile, he threw himself on General Molitor, who received him at the point of the bayonet, and then closing up the pass with 1,200 men, the French succeeded in holding 15,000 to 18,000 Russians in check for 8 hours. At length night came, and Molitor evacuated the Clonthal, and retired towards the Linth, to defend the bridges of Nofels and Mollies. The old field marshal rushed like a torrent over Glarus and Miltodi. There he learnt that Molitor had told him the truth, and that Jaliki and Linskin had been beaten and dispersed, that Messina was advancing on Schwitz, and that General Rosenberg, who had been given the defense of the bridge of Muada, had been forced to retreat, so that he found himself in the position in which he had hoped to place Molitor. No time was to be lost in retreating. Suwarrow hurried through the passes of Engi, Schwaden, and Elm. His flight was so hurried that he was obliged to abandon his wounded and part of his artillery. Immediately the French rushed in pursuit among the precipices and clouds. One saw whole armies passing over places where chamois hunters took off their shoes and walked barefoot, holding on by their hands to prevent themselves from falling. 3 nations had come from 3 different parts to a meeting place in the home of the Eagles, as if to allow those nearest God to judge the justice of their cause. There were times when the frozen mountains changed into volcanoes, when cascades now filled with blood fell into the valleys, and avalanches of human beings rolled down the deepest precipices. Death reaped such a harvest there where human life had never been before, that the vultures, becoming fastidious through the abundance, picked out only the eyes of the corpses to carry to their young, at least so says the tradition of the peasants of these mountains. Suwarrow was able to rally his troops at length in the neighborhood of Lindau. He recalled Korsakov, who still occupied Bregenz, but all his troops together did not number more than 30,000 men, all that remained of the 80,000 whom Paul had furnished as his contingent in the coalition. In 15 days Messina had defeated 3 separate armies, each numerically stronger than his own. Suwarrow, furious at having been defeated by these same republicans whom he had sworn to exterminate, blamed the Austrians for his defeat, and declared that he awaited orders from his emperor, to whom he had made known the treachery of the Allies, before attempting anything further with the coalition. Paul's answer was that he should immediately return to Russia with his soldiers, arriving at St. Petersburg as soon as possible, where a triumphal entry awaited them. The same ukase declared that Suwarrow should be quartered in the imperial palace for the rest of his life, and lastly that a monument should be raised to him in one of the public places of St. Petersburg. Fodor was thus about to see Vaninka once more. Throughout the campaign, where there was a chance of danger, whether in the plains of Italy, in the defile of Tesino, or on the glaciers of Mount Pragal, he was the first to throw himself into it, and his name had frequently been mentioned as worthy of distinction. Suwarrow was too brave himself to be prodigal of honors where they were not merited. Fodor was returning, as he had promised, worthy of his noble protector's friendship, and who knows, perhaps worthy of Vaninka's love. Field Marshal Suwarrow had made a friend of him, and none could know to what this friendship might not lead, for Paul honored Suvorov like one of the ancient heroes. But no one could rely upon Paul, for his character was made up of extreme impulses. Without having done anything to offend his master, and without knowing the cause of his disgrace, Suvorov, on arriving at Riga, received a private letter which informed him, in the emperor's name, that, having tolerated an infraction of the laws of discipline among his soldiers, the emperor deprived him of all the honors with which he had been invested, and also forbade him to appear before him. Such tidings fell like a thunderbolt upon the old warrior. Already embittered by his reverses, he was heartbroken that such storm clouds should tarnish the end of his glorious day. In consequence of this order, he assembled all his officers in the marketplace of Riga, and took leave of them sorrowfully, like a father taking leave of his family. Having embraced the generals and colonels, and having shaken hands with the others, he said goodbye to them once more, and left them free to continue their march to their destination. Suvorov took a sledge, and, traveling night and day, arrived incognito in the capital, which he was to have entered in triumph, and was driven to a distant suburb, to the house of one of his nieces, where he died of a broken heart 15 days afterwards.
On his own account, Fodor traveled almost as rapidly as his general, and entered St. Petersburg without having sent any letter to announce his arrival. As he had no parent in the capital, and as his entire existence was concentrated in one person, he drove direct to the general's house, which was situated in the Prospect of Nevsky, at an angle of the Catherine Canal. Having arrived there, he sprang out of his carriage, entered the courtyard, and bounded up the steps. He opened the antechamber door, and precipitated himself into the midst of the servants and subordinate household officers. They cried out with surprise upon seeing him. He asked them where the general was. They replied by pointing to the door of the dining room. He was in there, breakfasting with his daughter. Then, through a strange reaction, Fodor felt his knees failing him, and he was obliged to lean against a wall to prevent himself from falling. At this moment, when he was about to see Vaninka again, this soul of his soul, for whom alone he had done so much, he dreaded lest he should not find her the same as when he had left her. Suddenly the dining-room door opened, and Vaninka appeared. Seeing the young man, she uttered a cry, and, turning to the general, said, "Father, it is Fodor," and the expression of her voice left no doubt of the sentiment which inspired it. "Fodor," cried the general, springing forward and holding out his arms. Fodor did not know whether to throw himself at the feet of Vaninka or into the arms of her father. He felt that his first recognition ought to be devoted to respect and gratitude, and threw himself into the general's arms. Had he acted otherwise, it would have been an avowal of his love, and he had no right to avow this love till he knew that it was reciprocated. Fodor then turned, and as at parting, sank on his knee before Vaninka, but a moment had sufficed for the haughty girl to banish the feeling she had shown. The blush which had suffused her cheek had disappeared, and she had become again cold and haughty like an alabaster statue, a masterpiece of pride begun by nature and finished by education. Fodor kissed her hand. It was trembling but cold. He felt his heart sink, and thought he was about to die. "Why, Vaninka," said the general, "why are you so cool to a friend who has caused us so much anxiety and yet so much pleasure? Come, Fodor, kiss my daughter." Fodor rose entreatingly, but waited motionless, that another permission might confirm that of the general. "Did you not hear my father?" said Vaninka, smiling, but nevertheless possessing sufficient self-control to prevent the emotion she was feeling from appearing in her voice. Fodor stooped to kiss Vaninka, and as he held her hands it seemed to him that she lightly pressed his own with a nervous, involuntary movement. A feeble cry of joy nearly escaped him, when, suddenly looking at Vaninka, he was astonished at her pallor. Her lips were as white as death. The general made Fodor sit down at the table. Vaninka took her place again, and as by chance she was seated with her back to the light, the general noticed nothing. Breakfast passed in relating and listening to an account of this strange campaign which began under the burning sun of Italy and ended in the glaciers of Switzerland.
As there are no journals in St. Petersburg which publish anything other than that which is permitted by the emperor, Suvorov's successes were spread abroad, but his reverses were ignored. Fodor described the former with modesty and the latter with frankness. One can imagine the immense interest the general took in Fodor's story. His 2 captains' epaulets and the decorations on his breast proved that the young man had modestly suppressed his own part in the story he had told. But the general, too courageous to fear that he might share in Suvorov's disgrace, had already visited the dying field marshal, and had heard from him an account of his young protégé's bravery. Therefore, when Fodor had finished his story, it was the general's turn to enumerate all the fine things Fodor had done in a campaign of less than a year. Having finished this enumeration, he added that he intended next day to ask the emperor's permission to take the young captain for his aide-de-camp. Fodor, hearing this, wished to throw himself at the general's feet, but he received him again in his arms, and to show Fodor how certain he was that he would be successful in his request, he fixed the rooms that the young man was to occupy in the house at once. The next day the general returned from the palace of Saint Michel with the pleasant news that his request had been granted. Fodor was overwhelmed with joy. From this time he was to form part of the general's family. Living under the same roof as Vaninka, seeing her constantly, meeting her frequently in the rooms, seeing her pass like an apparition at the end of a corridor, finding himself twice a day at the same table with her, all this was more than Fodor had ever dared hope, and he thought for a time that he had attained complete happiness. For her part, Vaninka, although she was so proud, at the bottom of her heart took a keen interest in Fodor. He had left her with the certainty that he loved her, and during his absence her woman's pride had been gratified by the glory he had acquired, in the hope of bridging the distance which separated them. So that, when she saw him return with this distance between them lessened, she felt by the beating of her heart that gratified pride was changing into a more tender sentiment, and that for her part she loved Fodor as much as it was possible for her to love anyone. She had nevertheless concealed these feelings under an appearance of haughty indifference, for Vaninka was made so. She intended to let Fodor know some day that she loved him, but until the time came when it pleased her to reveal it, she did not wish the young man to discover her love. Things went on in this way for several months, and the circumstances which had at first appeared to Fodor as the height of happiness soon became awful torture. To love and to feel his heart ever on the point of avowing its love, to be from morning till night in the company of the beloved one, to meet her hand at the table, to touch her dress in a narrow corridor, to feel her leaning on his arm when they entered a salon or left a ballroom, always to have ceaselessly to control every word, look, or movement which might betray his feelings, no human power could endure such a struggle. Vaninka saw that Fodor could not keep his secret much longer, and determined to anticipate the avowal which she saw every moment on the point of escaping his heart. One day when they were alone, and she saw the hopeless efforts the young man was making to hide his feelings from her, she went straight up to him, and, looking at him fixedly, said, "You love me." Forgive me, cried the young man, clasping his hands. "Why should you ask me to forgive you, Fodor? Is not your love genuine?" Yes, genuine but hopeless." "Why hopeless?" "Does not my father love you as a son?" said Vaninka. "Oh, what do you mean?" cried Fodor. "Do you mean that if your father will bestow your hand upon me, that you will then consent? Are you not both noble in heart and by birth, Fodor? You are not wealthy, it is true, but then I am rich enough for both." "Then I am not indifferent to you? I at least prefer you to anyone else I have met." "Vaninka!" The young girl drew herself away proudly. "Forgive me," said Fodor. "What am I doing?" "You have but to order, I have no wish apart from you. I dread lest I shall offend you. Tell me what to do, and I will obey." "The first thing you must do, Fodor, is to ask my father's consent."
So you will allow me to take this step? Yes, but on one condition. What is it? Tell me. My father, whatever his answer, must never know that I have consented to your making this application to him. No one must know that you are following my instructions. The world must remain ignorant of the confession I have just made to you. And, lastly, you must not ask me, whatever happens, to help you in any other way than with my good wishes. Whatever you please. I will do everything you wish me to do. Do you not grant me 1,000 times more than I dared hope? And if your father refuses me, do I not know myself that you are sharing my grief? Cried Fodor. Yes, but that will not happen, I hope, said Vaninka, holding out her hand to the young officer, who kissed it passionately. Now be hopeful and take courage, and Vaninka retired, leaving the young man 100 times more agitated and moved than she was herself, woman though she was. The same day Fodor asked for an interview with the general. The general received his aide-de-camp as usual with a genial and smiling countenance, but with the first words Fodor uttered his face darkened. However, when he heard the young man's description of the love, so true, constant, and passionate, that he felt for Vaninka, and when he heard that this passion had been the motive power of those glorious deeds he had praised so often, he held out his hand to Fodor, almost as moved as the young soldier. And then the general told him that while he had been away, and ignorant of his love for Vaninka, in whom he had observed no trace of its being reciprocated, he had, at the emperor's desire, promised her hand to the son of a privy councillor. The only stipulation that the general had made was that he should not be separated from his daughter until she had attained the age of 18. Vaninka had only 5 months more to spend under her father's roof. Nothing more could be said. In Russia the emperor's wish is an order, and from the moment that it is expressed, no subject would oppose it, even in thought. However, the refusal had imprinted such despair on the young man's face, that the general, touched by his silent and resigned sorrow, held out his arms to him. Fodor flung himself into them with loud sobs. Then the general questioned him about his daughter, and Fodor answered, as he had promised, that Vaninka was ignorant of everything, and that the proposal came from him alone, without her knowledge. This assurance calmed the general. He had feared that he was making 2 people wretched. At dinner time Vaninka came downstairs and found her father alone. Fodor had not enough courage to be present at the meal and to meet her again. Just when he had lost all hope, he had taken a sleigh and driven out to the outskirts of the city. During the whole time dinner lasted, Vaninka and the general hardly exchanged a word, but although this silence was so expressive, Vaninka controlled her face with her usual power, and the general alone appeared sad and dejected. That evening, just when Vaninka was going downstairs, tea was brought to her room, with the message that the general was fatigued and had retired. Vaninka asked some questions about the nature of his indisposition, and finding that it was not serious, she told the servant who had brought her the message to ask her father to send for her if he wanted anything. The general sent to say that he thanked her, but he only required quiet and rest. Vaninka announced that she would retire also, and the servant withdrew. Hardly had he left the room when Vaninka ordered Anushka, her foster sister, who acted as her maid, to be on the watch for Fodor's return, and to let her know as soon as he came in. At 11 o'clock the gate of the mansion opened. Fodor got out of his sleigh, and immediately went up to his room. He threw himself upon a sofa, overwhelmed by his thoughts. About midnight he heard someone tapping at the door. Much astonished, he got up and opened it. It was Anushka, who came with a message from her mistress, that Vaninka wished to see him immediately. Although he was astonished at this message, which he was far from expecting, Fodor obeyed. He found Vaninka seated, dressed in a white robe, and as she was paler than usual he stopped at the door, for it seemed to him that he was gazing at a marble statue. "Come in," said Vaninka calmly. Fodor approached, drawn by her voice like steel to a magnet. Anushka shut the door behind him. "Well, "And what did my father say?" said Vaninka. Fodor told her all that had happened. The young girl listened to his story with an unmoved countenance, but her lips, the only part of her face which seemed to have any color, became as white as the dressing gown she was wearing. Fodor, on the contrary, was consumed by a fever, and appeared nearly out of his senses. "Now, what do you intend to do?" said Vaninka in the same cold tone in which she had asked the other questions. "You ask me what I intend to do, Vaninka? What do you wish me to do?" "What can I do but flee from St. Petersburg and seek death in the first corner of Russia where war may break out, in order not to repay my patron's kindness by some infamous baseness?" "You are a fool," said Vaninka, with a mixed smile of triumph and contempt, for from that moment she felt her superiority over Fodor, and saw that she would rule him like a queen for the rest of her life. "Then order me, am I not your slave?" cried the young soldier. "You must stay here," said Vaninka. "Stay here?" "Yes, only women and children will thus confess themselves beaten at the first blow. A man, if he be worthy of the name, fights." "Fight, against whom? Against your father?" "Never." "Who suggested that you should contend against my father?" "It is against events that you must strive, for the generality of men do not govern events, but are carried away by them. Appear to my father as though you were fighting against your love, and he will think that you have mastered yourself. As I am supposed to be ignorant of your proposal, I shall not be suspected. I will demand 2 years more freedom, and I shall obtain them. Who knows what may happen in the course of 2 years? The emperor may die, my betrothed may die, my father, may God protect him, my father himself may die." "But if they force you to marry?" "Force me," interrupted Vaninka, and a deep flush rose to her cheek and immediately disappeared again. "And who will force me to do anything? Father? He loves me too well. The emperor? He has enough worries in his own family, without introducing them into another's. Besides, there is always a last resource when every other expedient fails. The Neva only flows a few paces from here, and its waters are deep." Fodor uttered a cry, for in the young girl's knit brows and tightly compressed lips there was so much resolution that he understood that they might break this child but that they would not bend her. But Fodor's heart was too much in harmony with the plan Vaninka had proposed. His objections once removed, he did not seek fresh ones. Besides, had he had the courage to do so, Vaninka's promise to make up in secret to him for the dissimulation she was obliged to practice in public would have conquered his last scruples. Vaninka, whose determined character had been accentuated by her education, had an unbounded influence over all who came in contact with her. Even the general, without knowing why, obeyed her. Fodor submitted like a child to everything she wished, and the young girl's love was increased by the wishes she opposed and by a feeling of gratified pride. It was some days after this nocturnal decision that the knouting had taken place at which our readers have assisted. It was for some slight fault, and Gregory had been the victim, Vaninka having complained to her father about him. Fodor, who as a duca had been obliged to preside over Gregory's punishment, had paid no more attention to the threats the serf had uttered on retiring. Ivan, the coachman, who after having been executioner had become surgeon, had applied compresses of salt and water to heal up the scarred shoulders of his victim. Gregory had remained 3 days in the infirmary, and during this time he had turned over in his mind every possible means of vengeance. Then at the end of 3 days, being healed, he had returned to his duty, and soon everyone except he had forgotten the punishment. If Gregory had been a real Russian, he would soon have forgotten it all, for this punishment is too familiar to the rough Muscovite for him to remember it long and with rancor. Gregory, as we have said, had Greek blood in his veins. He dissembled and remembered. Although Gregory was a serf, his duties had little by little brought him into greater familiarity with the general than any of the other servants.
Besides, in every country in the world barbers have great license with those they shave. This is perhaps due to the fact that a man is instinctively more gracious to another who for 10 minutes every day holds his life in his hands. Gregory rejoiced in the immunity of his profession, and it nearly always happened that the barber's daily operation on the general's chin passed in conversation, of which he bore the chief part. One day the general had to attend a review. He sent for Gregory before daybreak, and as the barber was passing the razor as gently as possible over his master's cheek, the conversation fell, or more likely was led, on Fodor. The barber praised him highly, and this naturally caused his master to ask him, remembering the correction the young aide-de-camp had superintended, if he could not find some fault in this model of perfection that might counterbalance so many good qualities. Gregory replied that with the exception of pride he thought Fodor irreproachable. "Pride?" asked the astonished general. "That is a failing from which I should have thought him most free." "Perhaps I should have said ambition," replied Gregory. "Ambition," said the general. "It does not seem to me that he has given much proof of ambition in entering my service, for after his achievements in the last campaign he might easily have aspired to the honor of a place in the emperor's household." "Oh yes, he is ambitious," said Gregory, smiling. "One man's ambition is for high position, another's an illustrious alliance. The former will owe everything to himself, the latter will make a stepping stone of his wife, then they raise their eyes higher than they should."